to the pump. And seeing no one who is seeking to speak, does the gentleman seek to speak? If so, I'll yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from North Dakota.
Request the opportunity to speak for up to 10 minutes on the pending energy legislation.
Without objection.
I'm here today to introduce a substitute amendment to the Menendez Act, which is currently under consideration on the Senate floor. That is Senate Bill 2204. The amendment the substitute amendment I would like to introduce today is legislation that I've authored along with Senators Lugar and also Senator Vitter. It's legislation that would approve construction of the Keystone XL pipeline and authorize that construction proceed. That authority is provided to Congress under the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. And with gas prices now close to $4 and going higher, Congress needs to act. President Obama has turned down the pipeline. He continues to block the Keystone XL pipeline, and it is time for Congress to act on behalf of the American consumer. Every single American, every hardworking American is feeling this pain at the pump. Keystone XL pipeline would help us produce more supply, more energy supply for our country to help reduce the price of gasoline at the pump. It will help us create more jobs in this country, to put close to 13 million Americans who are now unemployed, to help put more of those Americans back to work, and of course to help reduce our reliance on oil from the Middle East. The first chart I have with me here today shows what's happening with gasoline prices in the United States. And this is over the last 3-year period, and this shows that the gasoline price was about $1.87 when President Obama took office 3 years ago. Today, national average, I believe, by AAA is on the order of $3.91. So the price of gasoline during the Obama administration's tenure has more than doubled. It has more than doubled. I think there's something like 8 or 9 states now where the average price of gasoline in those states is over $4. In places like Chicago, the President's hometown, I believe that the average price in Chicago is on the order of $4.68. If you go right down to the corner here, right near the Capitol, I filled my car the other day. It cost more than $100 to fill the tank, and I think the price was $4.39 a gallon. So what's the solution offered in the Menendez legislation? What's the solution proposed by the Obama administration? What is the solution proposed in this bill we're considering right now here on the Senate floor? Well, what that bill would do is it would raise taxes on energy companies. It would raise taxes on energy companies. Let's think about this. We're going to raise taxes on these energy companies, so we're going to increase their costs. When you add taxes, that means it not only raises their costs, which will create even higher costs at the pump for American consumers, but it also tends to restrict supply. If you want less of something, and if you want it to cost more, what do? You tax it. So this legislation does exactly the opposite of what will help the American consumers with the price of gasoline at the pump. Instead, we need to increase supply. We need to increase supply. By providing more supply, we help create downward pressure on gasoline prices. That helps our hardworking Americans not only today, but tomorrow as well. Let's talk about that. Why are gas prices high? It is supply and demand. This is economics. This is about supply and demand. You increase supply, you put downward pressure on prices. You increase demand, you put upward pressure on prices. Global demand for oil is growing. We know that. Global demand is growing. So we need to increase the supply, otherwise that growing demand continues to push gasoline prices higher. Here's the amount of crude oil that we produce in the United States, along with our good friends in Canada today. That's shown in the first bar on this chart. And you can see it's just below 10 million barrels a day. That's where we are now. with the current policies that the administration has in place, we will actually produce less supply in the future. Less supply in the future. So think about that. If gasoline prices are a function of supply and demand, it's not only the supply and demand today, it's what people anticipate the supply and demand will be in the future. If you have growing global demand, which we know we have, and we have an administration that is constricting supply, then not only do you have an issue in terms of present supply and demand, but you have people going, well, look, there's going to be less supply. We know there's going to be growing demand. That puts upward pressure on prices. So the actions of the administration have a direct impact, a direct correlation with the price of gasoline at the pump, and that's why, as I showed you on the previous chart, under this administration, gas prices have more than doubled. So what we need to do is we need to produce all of the above. We need to produce all of the above. Now, note that I said produce it. I don't mean talk about it. I don't mean block it when it comes to building needed infrastructure like the Keystone XL pipeline, or preventing us from drilling offshore, or preventing us from drilling onshore, or having red tape that prevents us from getting permits and regulatory burden that prevents us from producing more energy. I mean actually doing it, not blocking it, doing it. This third bar shows that if we just work to produce more oil and gas in the United States and Canada, we can produce more than we consume within 15 years. That's just oil and gas. That's not even all of the above. That doesn't count producing all the natural gas that we have in this country and in Canada, or biofuels, or other sources. That's just oil and gas if we start working to produce it, rather than have the administration continue to block it. And of course, that's what I'm talking about with the Keystone XL pipeline. The President has studied the Keystone XL pipeline, the administration has studied it, the State Department has studied it, the EPA has studied it for 3.5 years. Now, the Department of Energy has come out and said, they did a study, June of last year. In their study, they said, we need the crude in the United States, we will use the crude in the United States, and it will lower gas prices on the East Coast, on the Gulf Coast, and in the Midwest. That's Secretary Chu, Secretary of Energy, his Department of Energy produced the report, and that's what it said. So after 3.5 years, the President says, well, that's not long enough. We need more time. The administration needs more time to make a decision. After his own State Department said they'd have a decision done before the end of the year, the President says, no, we need more time, maybe sometime after the election, maybe. So we need more time to make the decision. So Congress said, okay, we'll help out. You've expressed concern about the routing of the pipeline through Nebraska. We'll pass legislation to kind of give you support and encouragement here. It says they can go ahead and build the pipeline, and we'll give them whatever time they need to reroute Nebraska so there's no issue, because that's what you've identified as the problem. We passed that legislation as part of the payroll tax extension, tax cut extension. President denies it, turns it down, blocks it. And he continues to block the Keystone XL pipeline today. So a couple weeks ago, bipartisan legislation, the very same legislation that I'm offering in this substitute amendment, we bring to the Senate floor. Bipartisan legislation. We have 11 Democrats that vote with us, 56 votes, well over a majority, 56 votes. And the reason we didn't get 60 votes on the legislation is because that day the President was calling members of this body, this Senate body, to get them to vote no. So we got 56 votes instead of the 60 we needed. And the very next week, after calling members of the Senate to get them to vote down this legislation that would authorize moving forward so that we could actually bring oil in from Canada, bring more oil from my home state of North Dakota to refineries to help out Americans at the pump, the very next week after blocking the pipeline, after calling members of the Senate to get them to vote against it, the President goes to Cushing, Oklahoma, and takes credit for this small portion, the southern leg of the pipeline project, saying that somehow he's expediting it. Interestingly enough, that's the only portion of the pipeline that doesn't require his approval. But after blocking it, he goes down and takes credit for somehow expediting the portion that was going to be built anyway Well, he continues to block the two-thirds that actually brings us more oil. So go back to what I said just a minute ago. We need more supply. If the policy of this country is to say all the above, but then go about blocking our ability to produce more supply, guess what happens? Prices go up. Because what counts are the actions. The market says, oh.
Senator's 10 minutes have expired.
I ask for permission for another 30 seconds.
Without objection.
So the market takes that into account and says, look, if supply is going to be constrained, then we anticipate higher prices in the future with growing global demand, and that's what you see, prices rising at the pump. Look, we can't have energy security in this country. We need to increase our oil production in this country and work with our neighbor to the north, Canada, rather than have them send their oil to China, which is what will happen if we can't build these pipelines. We need to increase our use of natural gas. We need to do all of the above, increase renewable fuels with a market-based approach, and we need to use technology to drive energy production in this country and working with Canada with better environmental stewardship. What I mean by that, in Canada, oil is produced in the oil sands. With in situ, which is the new technique, it's similar to drilling. Rather than the old methods, more energy, better environmental stewardship. Look, we can create a more secure energy future for our country. We can create jobs here in America, and we can reduce the price of gasoline at the pump for hard-working Americans. But we need to take common sense steps, and we need to take them now, to produce more oil and gas, to produce more energy of all kinds in this country. And we're asking for the President to work with us to do just that. So, Mr. President, I ask at this point, I have a parliamentary inquiry. When the Senate resumes consideration of the pending energy tax bill, would it be in order for me to offer my amendment, a substitute amendment, which would approve the Keystone XL pipeline to help Americans at the pump with the price of gasoline?
If the pending question was S-2204, it would take unanimous consent to offer an amendment to that measure because there is not an available amendment slot at this time.
So no amendments will be allowed. Well, Mr. President, I think that that is unfortunate. It is time, it is well past time to take action on behalf of the American people. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Alaska.
Mr. President, I follow my friend and colleague from North Dakota, who has been a real leader here in these chambers, trying to educate not only those in these chambers, but really across the country, the value, the importance of the Keystone XL pipeline and what it means to this country, not only in terms of a resource that we need, but also in terms of jobs, not only construction jobs, but what it means to fill up a pipeline and provide for a product that goes down to our refineries. Again, when we're talking about an economic boom here, where better to look than to our neighbors to the north, and I thank Senator Hoeven for his leadership on this. I, too, want to talk about our opportunity as a nation to do more when it comes to increasing supply within our own country. As has been mentioned on this floor numerous times today, numerous times yesterday, we are in a position as a nation to be doing more to access our own resources, to make us less dependent on countries that don't like us, to make us more energy secure, less energy vulnerable, and at a time when the geopolitical scene is so shaky. Every step that we can take to make us more secure from a national security perspective and an energy security perspective is clearly important. So I have a substitute amendment that I have filed that I think is important to this debate. I think it is important when we're talking about our access to supply. What I'm going to discuss here in my 10 minutes is not new. Members here have heard me talk over and over again about the prolific oil resources that reside in Alaska. According to the Energy Department, we've got over 40 billion barrels of oil that could be produced up north, providing not only the energy, but the energy security, the jobs, new revenues. We've got a pipeline that is built already. We don't need to deal with the permitting issues there. It's just waiting to carry oil. And we've got overwhelming support from Alaskans on this. But what we don't have is what is perhaps most important, and that's permission from the federal government to actually develop our huge oil fields. And the biggest on the continent is in the northwest corner of ANWR. For years, we have sought to develop a total of 2,000 acres in what is known as the 1002 area, for which Congress set aside back in 1980 to access for energy exploration. They knew back then that this area had great potential. The 1002 area is projected to contain more than 10 billion barrels of oil. If you were to put it in context this way, 1 million barrels a day coming down that pipeline, coming to us from ANWR, that's enough, Mr. President, to replace Venezuela or Saudi imports for about 30 years. About 30 years. To think that we could get off of Venezuela, that we wouldn't need to go to Saudi Arabia, tin cup in hand, because we're producing it ourselves here. Think about what that means to us. And for those who bring about the speculation argument and what that does to prices, just think how this would mess the speculators up if you add 1 million barrels a day online. But instead of us as a country embracing this as an opportunity, every excuse in the book has been thrown at us against development. We hear that the environment is going to be degraded, that wildlife will be disturbed, that despite a better environmental record than just about anywhere else in the world at Prudhoe Bay, we just can't do it. They don't trust us to do it. But for 20 years, we've been hearing now, well, don't go towards ANWR, don't develop ANWR, because, you know, it's going to take you 10 years to get that online. And so, therefore, it's not even worth considering. Even the late-night TV shows, Jay Leno jokes about that now, and he says, Democrats said it would take 10 years, 10 years ago. Well, Mr. President, if you don't get started, it's never going to happen. We're going to keep that money in the ground indefinitely if we don't get moving on it. So I don't accept the arguments that have been tossed out, but they haven't accepted the facts that we have presented. So I've got an amendment that's changed just a little bit here. It's designed to really address this debate. It would prohibit surface development entirely, and yet it still allows for a very substantial portion of the oil to be accessed from our state lands with drills reaching beneath the coastal plain. And we do this by allowing only subsurface occupancy. We use extended horizontal drilling production. Right now it can reach about 8 miles underground in all directions, and as the technology continues to advance, more and more of that refuge's oil could be tapped. And again, Mr. President, we're not going to be occupying the surface. This is no surface occupancy, is this legislation. All the land-based structures would be located on adjacent state lands. You wouldn't see permanent roads, wells, buildings, pipelines. We need to be constructed on the surface of the refuge. If you were to put together a slideshow of development, the surface would be unchanged before, during, and after production. So this is ANWR. This is probably in the spring because you've got tufts of grass that are coming up through the melting snow. But this is pretty much what it would look like before, during, and after, because we are underneath through the technology. So the amendment that I'm offering gives us here in the Senate a chance to put reason ahead of rhetoric, policy above politics when it comes to oil production in the state. It's a chance to end this decades-old dispute about whether or not development can proceed safely. We haven't just met the opposition halfway here on ANWR. We've met them 90% of the way. We've written it into the amendment more stringent environmental safeguards than on any other federal lands. We've sacrificed 90% of the revenues which Alaska is entitled to under our statehood agreement. We've proposed a 50-50 federal split, and now it just seems we're begging to access a small fraction of the reserves from miles away. It defies logic, Mr. President, to think that, again, an idea, a concept like this would be kept off the table. I realize that many are dug in on this issue, so I have attempted to change the debate, change the conversation. I would ask the Senate to take a moment to consider how far we have really compromised on this amendment, to understand why it is different, and I would hope that we can get a vote on it. Mr. President, I would ask at this time, as a point of parliamentary inquiry, when the Senate resumes consideration of the pending energy tax bill, would it be in order for me to offer my amendment, which is amendment number 1976, at that time?
If the pending question was S-2204, it would take unanimous consent to offer an amendment to that measure because there is not an available amendment slot at this time.
So the President is telling me that all of the available amendment slots have been filled by the Majority Leader?
That is correct.
I thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I have another issue that I would like to bring up today in the balance of my time. I've got two other amendments that I would like the body to consider. I understand what you have just said, but one of the things that I think we recognize is that much of our country's production can lag due to accumulation of red tape, due to permitting issues. We know that the federal government can't necessarily set global commodity prices, but it can create a situation where capital that might be invested in American mineral production is stranded for long periods of time, and that's exactly what we see happening. I think it's unacceptable. So what we shouldn't do then is, and particularly in the case of energy and minerals development, is to subject projects to an unnecessarily long permitting process. I have an amendment that would begin to remedy this situation, and it would do so by using the very language that the President used last week with his executive order he signed on March 22nd. My amendment incorporates provisions that have attracted pretty broad bipartisan support on the past highway bill that was considered by this body. These provisions are ones that will work. According to a September 2010 report by the Federal Highway Administration, these reforms have cut the time required to complete environmental reviews in half. They've mitigated the delays caused by last-minute legal challenges. What they do more specifically is take the President's executive order and put some teeth to them, if you will. The President just simply asked the agencies to consider making certain improvements, but what I have done through my legislation is ask for a process for states to nominate items that might be subject to NEPA, allows for a shortening of review periods, designation of a single lead federal agency, but it is a situation that I do think rests on a good premise. The President has suggested that this is an approach that needs to be considered when again, they're making such improvements. I would suggest that if it's good enough for the President, good enough for our transportation needs, as we've seen demonstrated in the highway bill, that it's good enough for our energy, mineral, and infrastructure needs as well. So, Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent to call up amendment number 1985, which includes all of the provisions that I have described.
Is there an objection?
Mr. President.
The Senator from Illinois.
Reserving the right to object, my friend and colleague, the Senator from Alaska, I would just say that we have a bill before us relative to the subsidies, tax subsidies being given to the major oil companies, $4 billion a year to companies which registered $137 billion in profit last year. It is such a popular measure that moving to it attracted a 92-4 vote in the Senate, and we are trying to bring that to closure and get a vote on it. I know the Senator has an amendment she feels is valuable. I don't know the merits of it. I'm sorry I wasn't on the floor to hear the entire explanation, but we have just gone through a transportation bill where after more than a week on the federal transportation bill, we entertained an amendment from your side on contraception. And so we'd like to, if we can, limit amendments to relevant issues and limit them in number and try to actually pass a bill in the United States Senate. It'd be almost historic. And I hope that we can do that in a bipartisan way, and I invite the Senator from Alaska to join us in conversation about that. But until we can reach an agreement on that, I'm afraid I'm going to have to object.
Objection is heard.
Well, Mr. President, I do think it's unfortunate that we won't have an opportunity. I know that several of my colleagues will be coming down, have already come down to offer up their amendments. We've been told that the tree has been filled. The amendment that I am proposing, I actually have two. One is I have described as probably broader in scope, but I actually have a second amendment that literally takes the President's executive order and provides for provides instructions to the agencies to do a rulemaking to implement them within 1 year. This is not something that the senator from Alaska has designed. This is the President's executive order, but I think it is designed to get us to an expedited permitting process so that we don't have the lag times that we see, whether it's on transportation infrastructure or whether it is on energy issues. I think it is a good measure, and I would ask my colleague from Illinois in the effort to be working together, which I appreciate, to take a look at this amendment. I apparently will not be able to introduce or to call up Amendment 1986, but again, what that legislation or what that bill would do is pretty simple. It's just to codify portions of the President's recent executive order. It's entitled Improving Performance of Federal Permitting. He has suggested it. I thought it made sense, and now we're urging the agencies to provide for an implementation. Again, I do think that this debate that we are having on the floor this week is an important debate. We're focused on the issues that people in this country are talking about. Folks back home are very concerned. I just met with a group of students, one young man, high schooler from Yakutat, probably driving his first car, and they are paying in excess of $5.50 at the pump. When you're a 16, 17-year-old boy, that's pretty high. When you're a person our age, that's pretty high. What are we doing as a Congress to help address these issues? So I can't overstate my disappointment that as we're dealing with these very difficult issues in what we all know to be a great deliberative body, that we can't move to a process where we could allow for fair and germane amendments that I think would help to address some of the energy challenges that we face. Recognize where we are today. I see that my colleague from Louisiana has joined us on the floor, and my time has expired. So with that, I will yield the floor and thank the President.
Mr. President.
The senator from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also come to the floor to offer amendments to this bill. And, Mr. President, through you, let me assure our colleague from Illinois they're not amendments about contraception or any other unrelated issue. They're energy amendments. They're amendments that go directly to one of the greatest challenges all of our constituents, fellow citizens face, which is the ever-rising price at the pump. I'm glad we're on this Menendez bill because at least it puts us on that major challenge that faces Louisiana middle-class families, lower middle-class families, and those families in Illinois and all around the country. And so I bring amendments directly relevant to that. The first amendment has to do with supply. You know, first of all, let me say, Mr. President, why I oppose the Menendez bill. It's because when you tax something at a higher level, when you increase the tax on it, you get less of it. And so it's going to produce less energy, in particular less U.S. domestic energy. And when you lower supply, you increase the price. It's not only not going to have a positive impact on price at the pump. It's going to increase the price, have a negative impact. I take the opposite approach. We need to increase supply, starting with activity and supply right here at home in the United States. And so my amendment, offered along with Senator Murkowski of Alaska, number 1965, would do that. What it would do is replace President Obama's current 5-year plan for outer continental shelf leasing with basically the plan that existed previously, which is double President Obama's plan. So President Obama's plan, which he put in place after coming into office, is about half of the previous plan. It backs us up. It turns us around, moving us in the wrong direction. Amendment 1965 would turn us back, move us in the right direction, and adopt pretty much that previous plan to expand our access to our own U.S. energy resources offshore. And so, Mr. President, with that said, I ask unanimous consent. Excuse me, 1 minute. I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate returns to consideration of S-2204, the pending energy tax bill, it be in order for me to offer amendment number 1965, which I have authored along with Senator Murkowski.
Is there an objection?
Mr. President, reserving the right to object.
Senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, the senator from Louisiana and I can get into a debate about whether taking $4 billion in subsidies away from 5 oil companies that reported $137 billion in profit last year is going to change production of oil, but we'll save that for another day. This amendment, like others, needs to go through your leader and with some understanding as to whether we're going to stay in the energy field or go far afield as we have in previous bills. I'm afraid I'm constrained until that conversation takes place between the leaders to object.
Objection is heard. The senator from Louisiana.
That's really unfortunate, and it's particularly unfortunate because everyone knows our leader, everyone on our side has absolutely agreed to offer energy amendments and give the other side an equal number of energy amendments, and we're perfectly agreeable to that, and everybody knows that. It's in that context that I bring up another energy amendment, our amendment number 1997. This has to do with another huge opportunity we have in the United States right here at home, and that's enormous oil resources that we can get from Western shale. According to the Institute for Energy Research, quote, the USGS, that's a government agency, estimates that unconventional U.S. oil shale resources hold 2.6 trillion barrels of oil, with about 1 trillion barrels that are considered recoverable under current economic and technological conditions. These 1 trillion barrels are nearly 4 times the amount of oil reserves as Saudi Arabia's proven oil reserves, close quote. That's the potential we have right here in this country. Enormous reserves, available now, recoverable now. What's the problem? Well, one big problem is that the Obama administration has canceled all leases to access this oil shale. There was movement to properly, responsibly access that 1 trillion barrels. That has been canceled under the Obama administration. My amendment number 1997, again, obviously an energy amendment, can affect price at the pump, would expedite movement toward that important resource and would get us moving again in the right direction, accessing that U.S. energy resource. And with that said, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate returns to consideration of S-2204, the pending energy tax bill, it be in order for me to offer that amendment number 1997.
Is there an objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Illinois.
For the reasons stated earlier, I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President, if I can wrap up again, I think it's really unfortunate. Everybody knows that Republicans are perfectly willing to limit ourselves to relevant energy amendments. That's what we're doing. That's what we're bringing on the floor. Leader McConnell has offered that. Leader McConnell has offered a like number of energy amendments from the Democratic side. What's happening is we're being completely shut down and shut out. Now, the main issue is not that I'm aggrieved. The main issue is that the American people are being shut out. The folks I represent, the folks all of us represent, are being shut out of offering good, sensible ideas to at least debate and vote on to access more American energy, more U.S. energy to help solve the pressing problem of the price at the pump in that way. Let's control our own destiny in that way. It's a sensible solution. It's a major solution. It'll move us in the right direction. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Arizona.
Mr. President, I'm glad to see the senator from Illinois here on the floor to object to my next proposal. Mr. President, you know what? Throughout our history, from time to time, we have passed legislation that if there was ever a need for it, passed a long, long time ago, yet it remains on the books. And I think one of the great and outstanding examples of that is a thing called the Jones Act. The Jones Act, I'm sure, may have had some rationale behind it back in 1920 when it was enacted. Well, and I'm not sure that there's one American out of 1,000 that has ever heard of the Jones Act. But the Jones Act has a direct impact on oil supplies, on the cost of oil, and the cost of other products. Because what the Jones Act says, incredibly, that any ship that goes between two U.S. ports, i.e. whether it be Honolulu, Hawaii, and San Francisco, or whether it be one of the Gulf Coast ports and to the northeast, or any place between two U.S. ports, can only be transported by U.S.-owned, U.S.-built, U.S.-owned, and U.S.-crewed vessels. So, I mean, talk about protectionism. I mean, there's probably no greater example than this. So, the Jones Act, enacted in 1920, that required that, has cost consumers, especially in places like Hawaii, where the transportation of goods is long distances, enormous amounts of money. In other words, the February 2012 Energy Information Administration report, there are only 56 tankers that meets the Jones Act requirements, which accounts for less than 1% of both the total number and the total deadweight tonnages of tankers in the world. So less than 1% of the tankers in the world are able by law to operate between two U.S. ports. So what does this do? I think obviously when you're talking about supply and capacity, it drives up the costs of petroleum. In fact, sometimes it's 2 or 3 times the rates that a foreign flagship rates, again, according to the Energy Information Administration. But not only that, the Jones Act tankers, those 56, aren't readily available, so the cost can be even higher than we're talking about. Let me just give you another example of the harms the Jones Act does to American consumers. 1999 U.S. International Trade Commission, not a Republican or Democrat or liberal or conservative organization, the U.S. International Trade Commission said that a repeal of the Jones Act would lower shipping costs by approximately 22%. A 2002 economic study from that same commission found that repealing the Jones Act would have an annual positive welfare effect of $665 million on the overall U.S. economy. That's probably now, given the price of oil, is close to $1 billion. The Jones Act adds real direct cost to consumers. As I mentioned, particularly, and I noticed the senator from Alaska on the floor, to Hawaii and Alaska. a 1988 GAO report found that the Jones Act was costing Alaskan families between $1,921 and $4,820 annual for increased prices paid on goods that were shipped from the mainland. In '97, a Hawaii government official asserted that, quote, Hawaii residents pay an additional $1 billion per year in higher prices because of the Jones Act. This amounts to approximately $3,000 for every household in Hawaii. Again, those figures are from 1988 to 1997, and obviously they are higher today. Now, everybody says that there's nothing that can be done immediately about the price of oil. My friends, if we repeal the Jones Act, we would have an immediate effect on the price of oil, because when you're transporting oil from the Gulf Coast to the Northeast, and it costs 2 or 3 times more if that supply is restricted to be transported only by these 56 tankers, then obviously, according to figures that are accurate, that it costs 2 or 3 times more, then by allowing other foreign flag ships to move these goods and services, but particularly oil tankers, you could cut the cost of oil, of gasoline immediately. So the next time you hear the President of the United States or my friends on the other side of the aisle, there's nothing that can be done now about reducing the price of a gallon of gasoline, you can do it by repealing the Jones Act immediately. And if there's ever a law that long ago outlived its utility or usefulness, if it ever had any, it was this law that was passed in 1920, only American built. You can't even buy another one that is a tanker or a ship that's built in another country and not have it fall into the Jones Act, even if it's American-owned and American crewed. Amazing. So obviously, what I'm leading to, obviously, is that we repeal the Jones Act. And if not repeal it, waive the Jones Act. If not waive it just for the transport of oil and for oil and gas tankers. If that's not enough, let's just waive it for 6 months. Couldn't we just do that for 6 months? So I know what the response of the senators from Illinois is going to be, and that's his duty here on the floor, and I respect that. But my friends, if we're really serious, the price of a gallon of gasoline is now this March, according to media reports, the highest that it's been in history, and depending on what happens in a lot of different areas of the world, particularly the Middle East, what happens with Iran and other things that are going on in this very dangerous world that we're living in today, it could go considerably higher. So why don't we take a common sense approach and at least for 6 months waive the requirements of the Jones Act only for oil and gasoline tankers for just 6 months. It seems to me that that would make a great deal of sense. So I know that all 4 of my unanimous consent requests on these amendments are going to be denied. But first of all, I think that the Jones Act should be repealed completely. But if it shouldn't be repealed, couldn't we at least waive the Jones Act restrictions on coast-wide trade for oil and gas tankers? If we can't waive it permanently for that, can't we waive those restrictions for 6 months? And if not that, can we just, because we are discussing energy and the price of oil, waive the restrictions, the Jones Act restrictions on coast-wide trade for oil and gasoline for 6 months? So, with the indulgence of my friend from Illinois, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate returns to consideration of S-2204, the pending energy tax bill be in order for me to offer, I want to offer them all, but to offer my amendment 1948, which, as I described, would waive the Jones Act restrictions, in other words, allow a foreign flag tanker to move oil and gas, a waiver for 6 months to move just oil and gas tankers so that we can immediately reduce the cost of transportation, which would then translate itself at the pump at every gas station in America.
Is there an objection?
Mr. President, reserving
Senator from Illinois.
the right to object. I believe the shipbuilding industry in Arizona is about the same size as it is in Illinois, so I don't come to this issue with any particular hometown or home state view, and I'm open to the Senator's suggestion. But I would say that at this moment we are clearly focused on doing one thing, and that is eliminating the $4 billion annual subsidy to the 5 big oil companies who registered $137 billion in profits last year. Moving to this measure was voted favorably by 92 senators, and we're trying to move this to a vote, and perhaps we move to another issue, the ones that you're proposing at another time. But at this point, I have no other alternative but to object to my friend.
Objection is heard.
Well, Mr. President, I always enjoy a little dialogue between myself and the senator from Illinois. I hope that he would have the same passion concerning all subsidies, including the outrageous and disgraceful subsidies that, and there is a lot of solar in the state of Arizona, a lot of solar. But I don't believe that, and I'll stop here, but I do not believe that if we're going to repeal the gas and oil subsidies, let's repeal them all. Let's repeal them all. And I'm not sure, again, the logic that says if we are able to immediately reduce the costs of oil by repealing the Jones Act, which then would reduce the cost of transportation, would then reduce the cost of gasoline, why we should out of hand reject such a notion, such a motion or an effort to do so. But I understand what the position of the majority is and the distinguished Democrat leader, so I know others are waiting, so I thank the senator and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. President. How much time remains on our side?
No time remains.
Okay. Ask unanimous consent to speak for up to 5 minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, President Obama often boasts about oil production that he really had nothing to do with, and my amendments that I'm bringing forth today would allow him to be proud of his own record instead of his predecessors. And that's why, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate returns to consideration of S-2204, the pending energy tax bill, it would be in order for me to offer amendment number 1956 and 1957. Amendment 1956 would accelerate permitting of oil and gas exploration on our federal public lands, and Amendment 1957 would require federal agencies to use existing environmental review documents for oil and gas permitting.
Objection.
Is there an objection?
Senator from Illinois, the objection is heard.
Mr. President, the reason I come to the floor today is to speak on behalf of these two amendments that I have filed to S-2204. A few weeks ago, we learned that oil and gas production on federal public lands and waters is down. Specifically, we learned that there was a 14% decrease in oil production on federal public lands and waters from 2010 to 2011, and an 11% decrease in gas production from 2010 to 2011. On March 14th, Bob Abbey, the director of the Bureau of Land Management, testified about this before the Appropriations Committee. He explained that there had been, quote, a shift in the oil and gas production, a shift, he says, to private lands to the east and to the south where there is a lesser amount of federal mineral estate. Well, that's why Amendment number 1956 would accelerate permitting for oil and gas exploration on our federal public lands, and that's why I just offered that. So I take a look at the amendments and the discussion on the bill on the floor, and that's why specifically I offered an amendment that would rescind the administration's rules requiring what is called master leasing and development plans. These regulations were put into place over 2 years ago by the Secretary of the Interior. It is unclear why the Secretary issued these regulations. They add more red tape, they cause more bureaucratic delay, and they slow down American energy production.
This amendment would also require the administration to set goals for oil and gas production on federal public lands. It would ensure that the United States maintains or increases onshore oil and gas production. I've also filed that second amendment, 1957, which would require federal agencies to use existing environmental review documents for oil and gas permitting. When we take a look at that amendment, this would expedite the time that it takes to prepare environmental analyses under the National Environmental Policy Act, often known as NEPA. Too often, NEPA delays onshore and offshore exploration. My amendment provides a common-sense solution. It requires agencies to use in whole or in part an existing environmental review document if the existing document was completed for a permit that is substantially the same as the permit under consideration. This amendment doesn't exempt agencies from complying with NEPA, and it does not provide for categorical exclusions. It simply requires agencies to use their previous work so they don't have to reinvent the wheel. So, Madam President, I am disappointed that the majority continues to prevent the Senate from doing its job and that we heard an objection to these amendments. High gasoline prices are causing hardships for American families and American businesses. My Republican colleagues and I have filed a number of amendments to S-2204. We would like to have votes on these amendments. We would like to take steps to increase American oil production. Instead, like we just saw, the majority says no. No to more American energy, they say. No, they say, to jobs. And no, they say, to strengthening our energy security. We can do better, Madam President, and it is my hope that we will. Thank you, Madam President, and I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Alaska is recognized.
Madam President, request permission to speak for up to no more than 5 minutes.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Madam President. I wanted to take just a few minutes this afternoon to thank my colleagues who have come down to the floor this afternoon and for their efforts to offer what I believe are very substantive, very meaningful amendments to the legislation that is before us. I think we can condense the message that you've heard here this afternoon pretty easily. The fact of the matter is that the bill before us is highly misleading, and I don't believe it will work. The legislation that has been introduced, S-2204, is not going to put an end to federal subsidies for oil and gas producers because there are none. There are no subsidies here. The oil and gas industry actually sends money to the federal government to the tune of tens of billions of dollars each year, and it's not the other way around. Basic tax deductions that allow businesses to retain more of their earned dollars is not the equivalent of handing them a check. And so I think that's the first thing that we need to get out on the table and make very clear. And the second point that I just want to reinforce is S-2204 is simply not going to work. By definition, increasing costs will not lower prices. There is nothing that I can think of that if we tax it more, it will make it more abundable, more affordable and more abundant. It just doesn't work that way. And judging from both history and some recent international examples, it's virtually certain that S-2204 would have damaging effects on this country. Back in 1980, the Carter administration imposed a windfall profits tax. We remember that. This was a tax that was imposed on domestic crude oil. And according to the Congressional Research Service, that tax reduced domestic oil production. It increased our dependence on foreign nations, and it collected far less in revenue than was expected. The example that is more current on an international scene is one that I spoke to yesterday, and this is the example in Great Britain. A year after raising its oil tax rates, production declines in Great Britain have increased from 6% per year to 18% per year. So as a result, Great Britain is reversing that course. They're now planning to offer new incentives to encourage producers to return to the North Sea. So all we need to do is look at a real-time example of what one country did in an effort to deal with high gas prices. They increased the taxes, investment and production goes overseas. Now they're turning the corner on this, and they're working to reduce their taxes. Madam President, I think there is clearly a better way here. The other side of the aisle has refused to even consider amendments that will increase federal oil and gas production, create good jobs in this country, generate billions of dollars of federal revenues at a time that we desperately need them, restrain, if not reduce gasoline prices, and increase our domestic energy security. We believe very strongly that the solution to these many problems should be a reasonable combination of increased domestic production, for which we have huge, world-class, untapped resources which are still locked up by our federal government. America could be the world's largest oil producer, and we could be independent of OPEC. That is real, Madam President. That is achievable. But we've got to set our mind to it. We've got to make that happen, and we've got to have the federal government get out of the way or help us with the right incentives to do so. The hundreds of billions of dollars in federal revenues from increased production could and should help support the research and the development of our renewable resources, our alternative energy, as well as efficiency and conservation. We know that building out the energy of the future, renewables, alternatives, this is expensive. How are we going to fund it? Well, many of us believe that resources that come from expanded production could help us with that. And yet what we're presented with today is a bill that does nothing more than raise taxes on an industry that has created good jobs, is providing us with a resource that we need. We're not even allowed to offer a single amendment to produce one additional drop of American oil. I think that's unfortunate, Madam President. I wish that it was otherwise. But I do think the debate, the discussion that we have had on this floor in the past couple days has been good and helpful in helping to educate the American public in terms of what we truly have as a nation, in terms of our capacity and our capability to produce if given the opportunity. And with that, Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from California is recognized.
What is the parliamentary situation at this time?
The majority retains 16 minutes in time.
Okay. I'm confused a little bit because didn't the minority get extra time? Did they not get extra time?
She asked for consent and no one objected.
Okay, well, I would ask consent that I have an additional 5 minutes onto the 16.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
So, Madam President, I think it's very important that we understand what we're trying to do here. The senator from Alaska said it's been a good debate. Yeah, it's been a good debate. But let me tell you what's not good. What's not good is that big oil is getting corporate welfare. Big oil is ripping us off at the pump. They never had greater profits. We're being asked to sacrifice and pay more at the pump because of instability in the world, because of problems with the refineries, even though we have never drilled as much as we're drilling now. Big oil exports our oil now. We've never had as many exports as we have now. And big oil gets billions of dollars of subsidies, so big that I will tell you $2 billion a year in U.S. tax breaks. And let me tell you, to just explain how that compares to something we do that's very near and dear to my heart and every mother and father, grandma, grandpa, aunt, and uncle, which is we put about $1 billion a year into after-school programs, Madam President, when we have millions of children waiting, $1 billion a year on after-school programs where we give away $2 billion a year to the most, shall we say, successful companies in America. I want to show you what I'm talking about because I don't want people to think this is rhetoric. These are the facts. So when my Republican colleagues come on the floor and defend these profits, let's talk about what they are. Now remember, we have been in a deep recession for several years now. Remember, Madam President, as well you do, that President Obama and we had to confront the loss of 800,000 jobs. A month. A month. And now, thank goodness, he's turned it around. We've turned it around. It's still not good enough, but we were in the worst situation. During that time, small businesses went out of business. People lost their homes. If it wasn't for the President's leadership, we would have lost the auto industry in America. Thank you, Mr. President, for saving the auto industry in America. Thank you for that. And I was proud to vote for that, even though I had a lot of problems with the auto industry not moving quickly enough to fuel-efficient cars. Now they're doing a great job with it. So during that time, when Americans were suffering, we were bleeding all these jobs, and even now just getting back on our feet, what has happened to big oil? While they have raised our prices at the pump. In 2009, this is all the 5 oil companies made $64 billion. In 2010, Madam President, big oil made $74 billion. And in 2011, they made a whopping $137 billion. So they went from $64 billion in 2009 to $137 billion in 2011, and my Republican colleagues are crying bitter, bitter tears for them. Oh, let's keep giving them back $2 billion a year. Why? Why would we do that when we are sacrificing and our constituents are paying more at the pump and big oil is profiting from it? There's no reason for this kind of an increase at the pump. There's no reason for it. Look at what's going on here. If they just made the normal profits that they made, we could have some relief at the pump. But oh no. And so now we're going to reward them, the Republicans are, by allowing them to keep these subsidies. That started a long time ago. When did those subsidies start?
In 1986, we ready them.
In the 80s, most of them. In the 80s. Because we wanted to help them get moving. Well, how much more do they have to earn before we say they can get off corporate welfare? You talk about welfare queens, here it is. And my Republican friends defend giving these people who have ripped us off at the pump billions of dollars of subsidies. And they're exporting the oil they drill here. They won't keep it in the country. We had a proposal for the XL pipeline, Madam President, to keep the oil in the country. My friends voted against it on the other side of the aisle. They don't care. They just want these companies to have their way, to do with it what they want. And if they want to send our oil to China, fine. That's what they want. But they also want to keep their subsidies. It isn't right. I want to see these subsidies done with, and I want to see us invest in alternatives to these big oil companies that hold us by the throat and have alternatives. I have been all over this country looking at the alternatives that we're developing now. We know, for example, in Brazil, they use the sugar beet to create their gasoline, and they are completely free from imported oil. That's the kind of thing we need to do. I'm fortunate that I drive a hybrid vehicle, and I get 50 miles to the gallon. So I don't go into those for gas that often. But when you go in there, it's a shock. We want to have cars, and let them be big cars. If people need that for their families, I understand it. I have grandkids. I know what it is to put your grandkids in a small car. It's hard. We need to have the larger cars. They need to be fuel efficient. We're going to get there. We are getting there already. So isn't it better to take that money away from people who are ripping us off at the pump, away from the corporate welfare queens here, and put it into alternatives so our people are no longer victims to their prices? And that's the fight we are having. That's the debate we are having. And on the other side, they say, drill, baby, drill. And you know what? I'm for drilling where it makes sense. Do you know how many acres the oil companies are holding now that they haven't drilled upon? It is pretty amazing. My friends say, open up the Arctic to drilling, a precious environment, God-given, placed in a refuge by, I believe it was Dwight Eisenhower. Am I right on that? Yes. They want to go in there and ravage it. Why don't they drill on their non-producing acres? It looks like 75 million non-producing acres onshore and offshore that they hold leases on. Oh no, that's not good enough for them. They're only drilling on 25% of the leases they hold, of the acreage that they hold in those leases. How about use it or lose it instead of drill, baby, drill? Drill, baby, drill in here. Don't go into the coast of California where they want to go, or Washington or Oregon where we have fishing, tourism, recreation. You know, there's so many people here that I listen to that make the arguments for the oil companies. I am so tired of it. How about speaking up for the American people who are getting brutalized at the pump? How about speaking up for the people who make their living off a beautiful, pristine environment? Oh, by the way, many, many jobs in my state. Over 400,000 jobs. 400,000 jobs related to a pristine coastline, and they don't care about that on the other side. They want to open it up, push these people out of the way, and create a few jobs, because there are far fewer jobs created from drilling. And as President Obama has said many times, and the other side gets rankled, we only have 2% of the world's proven oil reserves, and we use about 20% of energy. So you do the math. As the President said, you could drill in your grandmother's bathtub, you could drill in the Great Lakes, you could drill anywhere you want. You're not going to find enough oil. So let's get off foreign oil. Let's tell the oil companies to drill, baby, drill where they have the acres. And let's look at these prices, and let's understand, and we'll look at it again, the profits of big oil. They are crying all the way to the bank, as my dad used to say. Look at this. In the height of the recession, they are making record profits and crying to keep their subsidies, and my Republican friends crying right along. Oh, here, have a tissue. We're so sorry for you. We're so sorry for you, even though we have to turn away millions of children from after-school programs because we don't have more than $1 billion to spend on it. They're giving away $2 billion a year. That's just one example. That's just one example. I hope we vote for the Menendez bill. I hope we vote tomorrow on that to stop the filibuster, to vote it up or down. Because what a message it will send of hope to the American people, that we are willing to stand up to the biggest powers that be, that we are willing to fight for the average American, that we're not in the pockets of big oil. You don't need to give American taxpayer dollars to big oil. It's absolutely ridiculous. And you don't have to allow them to drill in pristine areas when they won't even drill in areas that they have had under lease for years. And let's stop them from exporting the oil. We need it. Let's keep it here. Let's keep it here. And by the way, if they keep on ripping us off like this and getting rewarded for it from my Republican friends, let's release some oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, Madam President, and let's increase the supply and let's see prices go down. Let's look at the CEOs of big oil for a minute. These poor guys that are fighting for these subsidies, let's look at them. CEOs for the Big Five made more than $14.5 million in total compensation in 2010. This is it. Average compensation. Madam President, that's 307 times the average salary of a firefighter. That's 273 times the average salary of a teacher. That's 263 times the average salary of a policeman. That's 218 times the average salary of a nurse. But they need subsidies for their companies. And they need to rip us off at the pump so they can make a little more money. $14.5 million just isn't enough for a poor oil company executive. Give me a break. And stop giving them a break, because they don't need this break. So, we have an opportunity to stand up for what's right. And I hope that we take it. Because right now, we want alternatives to big oil. We want competition for big oil. We want to be able to become energy independent. So let's stop these taxpayer handouts. The oil companies don't need them. Let's start investing in America's energy future, which, by the way, that kind of investment creates many jobs at a time that we need to do that. And I want to switch topics here in the remainder of my time and talk a minute about health care and then close with a little bit about the highway bill over in the House and the struggle over there to get their work done. And so I'd ask how many minutes I have left.
Senator, you have 6.5 minutes remaining.
Would the chair advise me when I have 2 minutes left?
I will advise